screens, this was the place where I served as a priest for 8 years before I was here. It's a well-known shrine in Malta. In fact, Our Lady appeared to those two people in 1883, and even popes were there. In fact, this is Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis, and recently even Pope Francis came over. And I'm showing this picture because years ago I was hearing confessions on the door on the left-hand side of that photo. And when I was there, all of a sudden a woman came. She was a Chinese person, an unbeliever. It was her first time coming into a church. And she came crying because when she was in front of the Blessed Sacrament, she felt something great. She couldn't explain it well. But her experience was she felt this great presence, which then I explained to her it was God, and her reaction was the desire to confess her sins. And in fact, she confessed her sins. She asked my blessing, and then later on went to tell her group what had happened. This experience is a good introduction to what we have just read, the story of the Samaritan woman. And in this story, there are some things that are hidden from us who don't know their culture. What Jesus did in this story was something great. It's important to know that between the Jews and the Samaritans, there was a conflict that was a 750-year-old conflict. And both the Jews and the Samaritans during the time had condemned each other. In fact, they were not allowed to marry each other. They were not allowed to drink and eat with each other. And if possible, they were asked to avoid any type of social interaction like this. Moreover, it was at noon when this happened. And this means that this woman was an outcast even from her own community. Because normally women used to go and fetch water either early in the morning or in the evening to avoid the sun in the noon, to avoid the heat. And what Jesus did is great. He went against the odds. He broke all these barriers and started a relationship with this woman. And this introduces us well to the theme of this Lent. As Father James has explained 2 weeks ago, the theme for the preaching of this Lent is Lent in the time of less. And Father James explained how certain securities that we had up to a few years ago, they are gone. He explained that we are facing polarizations through wars, financial, food, and housing insecurity. Loneliness is greater than ever before. And all this will lead us to a deserted place. On top of this, we had last week Bishop Scott. And for those who are not here, I'm going to put a slide. You can see that boy with that chocolate milk in his hands. Bishop Scott explained to us that sometimes we receive gifts, like when you put the syrup, chocolate syrup, in the milk. But if we don't stir that milk, this syrup will stay at the bottom, and we don't experience the gift that we have received, which is, in this case, the chocolate syrup. And Father and Bishop Scott explained to us that the sacraments are the same. We have the sacraments, and sometimes we need to stir them up to enjoy what we have. And in today's homily, we're going to stir up the Sacrament of Reconciliation. The sacrament, we call it also confession. What's this sacrament? Let's define it first. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Sacrament of Reconciliation is a sacrament of healing through which Christ extends his forgiveness to sinners, reconciling them to himself and the church. In practice, this sacrament is a very private one. It happens normally between the priest and the person. No one is there, and no one will ever know what has been said. In fact, like the Samaritan woman had a chance to encounter Christ, each one of us, through the person of the priest, has a chance to encounter God and confess his own sins. In fact, it's important to notice that the priest, while hearing confession, he is acting in the name of Christ, and he can never say what was told in the confessional. Even if a judge in court asks us to speak about what we have heard in confession, we can't tell the judge. We're protected by law up to now, and even if we're not protected by law, no priest will ever open his mouth. And the fact that it is personal, there is this personal relationship, through confession then, we can receive a tailor-made guidance, encouragement, and support. Confession is not like this homily, I'm speaking in general. But when we are talking in the confessional, it's something more private. And the fact that there is a person, that there is a priest listening to confession, when we receive the verbal absolution, for us it's a tangible assurance that we have received forgiveness. In fact, if I confess directly to God, I can be doubtful if God had forgiven me or not. But once I receive the absolution from another priest, from another person, I can rest assured that all my sins are forgiven forever. And the question is that we need to face now, why do I need to go for confession? The first reason for confession, so that we can be freed. In fact, this Samaritan woman was, we can call her enslaved. She was escaping people. But after meeting Jesus, she was not scared to show herself within her community. And from my experience, and I showed you that shrine, sometimes I used to hear confessions even up to 8 hours each day. When people has a sin which is burdening them, especially for years, sometimes there are negative effects both on our way of thinking and sometimes also on our body. In fact, people claim that when they were under the influence of sin, there was more anger, more guilt, more fear, more anxiety. And something strange that I heard more than once, after people experience God through a good confession, others will tell them that they look a little bit taller. And that's real, because sometimes when we are worried, we tend to go like this. If that worry goes away, our shoulders go up, and people can experience that we are a little bit taller. So the first reason for confessing is to free ourselves from the sin that we have committed in the past. Other reason is to be empowered for the mission. Why? If we see the story that we have just read of the Samaritan woman, by the way, the Samaritan woman was a foreigner, a woman, and a sinner. And she is the first apostle that we have in Scripture. So God, Jesus, chose this woman who was a sinner, who was a foreigner, to go and witness to him. And through a good confession, we will be empowered to serve others, to serve more our community, and to be witnesses to God without being fearful, even at the place of work. The issue is that sometimes we don't receive this gift because we are blocked. And like the Samaritan woman, we need to get rid of these barriers. We need to face these barriers. The first barrier that we need to face, that sometimes we worry too much before going for confession. We go there scared or shy. I assure you not to worry about this. The priest has heard everything, and even if he has heard, it is not his role to judge you or not. So I invite you not to worry about that. The second blockage might be a past experience. For example, once I went for confession in Rome, I was a young priest. The only thing I said in the confessional, I'm a priest. And from the other end, the priest started shouting and telling me that I'm there to waste his time, and he made a lot of prejudgments. That doesn't mean that, because I have said nothing. So the only thing I did, I told him, sorry, you should not be here. I stood up and went to find another priest. So I invite you not to be blocked by any past experience in relationship to priests. We have to pray for them, and if they don't behave well, we can report them as well. Another issue that we need to face is the cultural shift on what is sin. Up to 20, 30 years ago, the culture, especially the Irish culture, used to teach us that everything is sin, even if we breathe. And the pendulum has shifted now. And nowadays we don't know what is sin. But sin still exists. And here is the definition of sin for us to understand better what is sin. A sin is an act contrary to the will of God, either by direct action, that is an act contrary to the gospel, or a failure to act, that is not doing what Jesus asked us to do, or an interior attitude that is not in alignment with God's love. So that is sin, and we need to think about it and reflect whether we have committed sins in the past or whether we are doing our best according to our abilities and talents to be witnesses to Christ. And the issue about confession, that everyone goes for confession. Here is a photo of the Pope at confession. I myself go to confession every 2 weeks. I try at least, or when I need. And the question is especially for someone who is not used to confession. And the question always is, what shall I do? And the answer is very simple. If you're able to talk, you can go for confession. That's what we do in confession. We talk with each other. So if you're able to talk or shout at your children or talk with your parents, you're able to come for confession. The next question is, what shall I confess? If you have done an immortal sin, something grave, probably you know it already, and you don't need to think about it that much. On top of this, I invite you that when you go for confession, you make a short reflection on how am I using my gifts and talents. Am I using them for the good of the church, for the good of others? I'm a witness to Christ in my workplace, because that's a sin as well that needs to be confessed. And I invite you also not to worry too much about the details. When you come for confession, if you don't know the act of contrition, it's okay. If you don't know what has to be done, just ask the priest to help you. So the invitation today is for each one of us to take a commitment that, if possible, to go for confession before Easter. And as a parish, we're going to give you an opportunity. The date is on the 8th of March, the Women's Day. So when you go to work and see, and people say that is the day dedicated for women, you will remember that that's the day in which we have confessions. And the confessions are going to happen here between 9:30 in the morning and 6 in the afternoon. And I invite you just to commit yourself for this. I know that you're desiring it, but if you wish, take your mobile out now from your pockets and schedule it on your calendar. Once it's scheduled, it's done. If you can't come for confession this Friday, it's okay. You can ask for a private appointment or seek another place. On Friday, we are going to have a list of priests who are coming to be here for confessions, and this list is going to be published also online so that you can select the priest that you like or avoid the one that you want to avoid. You are free to choose. There are thousands of priests. You can always find someone who clicks with you. So I invite you that now is the chance. Now is the chance to be freed from your past. Now is the time to be empowered. So I invite you to allow Christ, who is risen, to be risen through your life, especially through a good confession. Let us pray on this, and those who haven't brought their mobile out, you can bring it out now and schedule an appointment to come for confessions. In silence, we pray.